Hello everyone, tonight is the Oscars. This video was supposed to go up on Friday and it's therefore late, and I'm sure you care a lot about that. So what I'm going to do is review basically every movie nominated for any category at the Oscars, with the exception of short films and documentaries. I have already reviewed last year's Oscars and the first ever Oscars, so I will link to those and please watch them. Also, do all the algorithm stuff now so you don't forget. And aside from that, I'll say that when it would be very difficult for me to watch a film legally in the UK, I won't be able to review it. I know right now that the only film of which that's the case is I'm Still Here. I'm also not going to be reviewing big franchise movies like Alien, Romulus and Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, because I may want to review those franchises in their entirety at some point, and it makes sense for my reviews of big franchise movies to be contextualized within my wider thoughts on the franchise as a whole. However, sometimes if a film in this video is a sequel or remake, I will review the original film just as an extra bonus, so that will in part make up for what I'll not be reviewing. Indeed, you'll see an example of that right now as we jump in. So before we talk about Dune Part 2, let's talk about Dune Part 1. I'm going to start off with my main criticism, which is that this film absolutely does feel like part 1 of a complete story. How severe you think this is as a criticism is up to you, but when I watch a movie I want to think, that was a great movie, not, well, that might be a good movie, depending on part 2. The big issue is this film doesn't have much of a climax. If I remember correctly, the final line is, "This is just the beginning," and yeah, I am super excited to see where this goes, but I'm not actually excited about the end of the movie itself. It is, after all, just a ritualistic duel he has with this random guy for what is basically no reason. I don't really care about this dude and have little interest in this conflict. The conflict I'm really interested in is the one with the Harkonnens. I genuinely love how evil the Harkonnens are portrayed, really captivating antagonists who I was genuinely very excited to see face some sort of consequences for their evil actions in this film. I do find it a little bit cliche and not exactly subversive that the Atreides are basically perfectly good while the Harkonnens are perfectly evil. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, like obviously plenty of fantasy has extreme good and bad in characters, but other aspects of this movie feel like it's trying to be sort of realistic, so a little more nuance in the presentation of the two teams could be nice. Kind of reminds me of how everyone acts like Game of Thrones is this really nuanced, complicated show, and in some ways it is, but at the same time it's about a conflict between the Starks, who are basically all honourable good people, who are all about doing what's right, and the Lannisters, who are almost all cynical and corrupt and just straight up evil. But on a visceral level, I love how horrific the Harkonnens are shown to be. It's just so creepy and mysterious. A lot of this movie is creepy and mysterious. Although, speaking of being shrouded in darkness, watching this film outside of a pitch black cinema makes you realise that some scenes are so darkly lit it's almost impossible to see what's going on. That's not a serious criticism because you could just make sure to watch this at night and turn out all the lights, but it does mean you can't enjoy this film watching it on your phone in daylight on the bus, and that's the only way I was planning on watching movies now that David Lynch is dead. I love that this movie feels like we're stepping into a complete world that exists well beyond the scope of the story, because there's things we don't see and a deep history. Sometimes they communicate that through exposition that feels maybe not that creative, like Paul just watching documentaries and characters just telling each other things. This isn't terrible because in real life people do watch documentaries and do tell each other things. It's just never great when you have a clear sense that the primary purpose of dialogue is to inform us, the audience, about something rather than being able to pick up that thing ourselves in a more subtle way. I feel like I'm stacking up a massive compliment sandwich as I keep bouncing back and forth between positives and negatives. For example, I really like the Game of Thrones vibe to this. The idea that all these various houses are competing within this imperial system where they have to subtly undermine each other for the favour of the crown. But frankly, I almost wish that there was more of that. I want to know more about the political intrigue and how this system functions, especially since the most climactic moment of this film is when House Atreides is attacked and largely killed off, which occurs in the middle. With a bit more time spent focusing on the backdoor dealings and building up the complicated tension, the film could have had a much better ending with this big battle. The way it is, it kind of just feels like the movie gets impatient. There's this whole idea of Arrakis as a poison chalice, and you think we're going to slowly see how House Atreides falls as their soft power and credibility is gradually chipped away. But then it's just like, nah, they're going to send a force to murder them and the Emperor's just going to help them too. I'll close with some unambiguous positives. I like the logic of why melee combat is more common in this universe due to the shields they have that stop projectiles. I also like the deeper world building in terms of culture, especially the idea that for the Fremen, spitting is a sign of respect as you are giving up the scarce resource of your own moisture. And of course, the cinematography and production design is really good. Villeneuve is a fantastic visual director, as most people already know. Finally, I am honestly really glad this movie exists. Dune is such an iconic book, and it seems like this eventual trilogy will do a fantastic job at bringing attention to the core story of Paul Atreides. Unfortunately, I'm not reviewing an eventual trilogy, I'm reviewing a single film. And this single film is actually a little bit unsatisfying. Obviously, this won't matter if you watch the first film and then move straight onto the second as part of a Dune marathon. That's what I'm doing, as you can imagine. If the second film does a great job bringing it home, then that will be reflected in the review of that film. But I can't give this film too much credit for setting things up when it's mostly entirely set up, and I'd like just a little bit of payoff, and for the ending even of a film qualified as being part 1 to have some sense of finality. So I'm going to give it a high 6. It's a good film that I'd happily enjoy as the first part of a trilogy that tells a complete story, but as things stand, this film is way too dependent on how all the stuff it sets up is paid off in part 2, so I guess we'll move on to that. So, did Dune Part 2 make it all worthwhile? Did it deliver on the anticipation of a great climax established from the first film? In a word, no. For me, the big issue with this film is I don't think it really had much of a character arc, just a character switch. Generally, that's not a good thing. Paul starts off insanely resistant to the idea of being considered the Mahdi or Lisan al-Gaib. He foresees that this will lead to death and destruction, so he doesn't want to do it. Already for me, this is kind of an issue. It makes it seem like there are no real barriers to his success and no struggle or challenge. It's just a matter of him deciding to become the Messiah, and then everyone pretty much falls into line. This would be okay if the movie was about him slowly becoming more single-minded in his pursuit of power, but that doesn't happen either. Like I say, there isn't really a character arc. He just drinks some magic potion and next thing you know, he's immediately 100% into the idea of being a leader and is even giving authoritarian speeches about how no one can stand against him. Similarly, I don't really get what Chani's deal is. Like, I don't understand why she alone is so skeptical of this Messiah thing, while everyone else is completely on board with it. I'm not saying her position is unjustified, but it kind of just gives off the vibe that she's objecting to it just to be different and she's annoyed that everyone else is going along with it. Another underdeveloped aspect of this movie, in my view, is the war itself. Also, the subtle political maneuvering is basically entirely absent. Like, the Bene Gesserit are still there as a force apparently in control of everything, but the only thing they really do is decide that they could be able to control this new guy called Freyd, who's another evil villain. He is actually pretty intimidating, but then he dies. Indeed, the Harkonnen come across as quite impotent in this film. At the start, they're just being taken out by basic hit-and-run tactics, but then, later on, they're able to blow up a whole load of Fremen settlements, and I'm left thinking, why didn't they do that before? Also, they think that the south side of the planet is completely uninhabitable, but it turns out there's millions of people there. And when Paul eventually decides to attack the Harkonnens, there's no real challenge at all. They massively outnumber them, and they have giant sandworms. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, also, totally out of left field, we find out that they have a cache of nuclear weapons. Can you see what I'm saying about how a lot of this stuff just feels like it isn't sufficiently built up? I was also a bit disappointed that we just see the Emperor right at the start of the film. In the first film, he sort of felt like a figure who was super powerful and above everything, but then he's just a guy. I also like that in the final battle, his soldiers don't seem to have any sort of well-drilled formation, and the battle just immediately devolves into everyone breaking off into their own private duels. The one thing the movie did a really good job showing is Paul's acceptance into Fremen society. It starts right where the last film left off, but it felt completely natural seeing him go from an outsider to being part of their community. The only jump that felt slightly rushed was him suddenly learning to ride a sandworm, when only a few moments earlier, people were saying he'd never get to that level. There's also one moment where Stilgar says there are trapdoor spiders in the desert, and I was expecting at some point someone would get ambushed by giant spiders. Sad that didn't occur. I do think thematically this movie is interesting within the specific context of the Iraq War still being a recent memory and the occupation of Palestine being an ongoing memory. Also the mixed results of the Arab Spring in terms of the long-term impact. Having this messianic leader from an Arabic-coded society resisting an occupation feels like an interesting parallel to a lot of contemporary events. Although if we're going to mention politics, I should point out that this is literally a white savior narrative, like it couldn't be a more obvious example of that, but the real issue is I don't know that this movie actually has that much to say about its subject matter, about resisting imperialism or religious revivalism and fundamentalism. Also, I kind of have heard it said that these movies are really weird and complicated and there are all sorts of complex layers to them, but I didn't get that impression at all. In fact, this story actually feels smaller in part 2 than it did in part 1. In part 1, there was a sense that this was just a small conflict as part of a huge empire, but in this film, it feels like almost everything is centered around this planet. Not necessarily a bad thing, but generally I'd say it's better when in fantasy worlds, the world feels a lot bigger than just the focus of the narrative. Everything technical about this film is fantastic, I should say that, because that's where most of my positive feelings come from, but the issue is, I don't really like the story that much. The main issue is none of what happened felt like an organic character change motivated by something that I could identify and appreciate. Instead, this movie is about a guy who just one day decides to become a messianic leader, and then he's effortlessly able to do so because he has a huge amount of resources at his disposal due to actions well beyond his own efforts. At the end of the first one, I was thinking it was reliant on part 2 to bring it home, but this is now a complete story. It's over 5 hours, and I can't see myself feeling that inclined to invest 5 hours of my time to these films again. So yeah, for me, it's a low 6. That's kind of generous considering my lack of interest in the story. I think I've kind of made a case for this movie being actively bad and as such lower than a 5 out of 10, but I still do like all the production aspects, and there's some basic intrigue just from this being a fantastical sci-fi world. Conclave starts with a very good premise. Obviously, when the cardinals pick the Pope, they have to be sequestered, and that creates a lot of potential for intimate character drama. It also occurred to me, it would make a fun premise for an Exorcist-style horror movie. If I see that in the cinema soon, I'll know one of you stole my idea. All the weird clandestine political maneuvering in organized religion is inherently interesting, because there's an extra level of complexity to it that everyone involved is supposed to be a good-hearted, honest person. It's not just that you have to take your opponents down, but you have to do it in subtle ways. In this case, the simple drama is between traditional and progressive Catholicism. I will say it seems unbelievable how overt people are about their leanings in this regard. The traditionalists are like, the church is terrible and has lost its way, and we need to bring back burning heretics at the stake. Meanwhile, all the liberals are like, oh, I disagree with everything the conservatives stand for unambiguously, and it's important we defeat them. I don't know, I think they'd at least try to check their obvious ideological leanings at the door, and at least pretend that they're trying to represent the views of a higher authority. Anyway, for most of this movie, the conservatives are really pulling ahead, so that aspect of the drama is pretty one-sided, but there's a moderate who you'd think would obviously win as the compromise candidate, so to make that interesting, they also have to introduce that he's incredibly corrupt. There's a whole mystery building up to this that is complicated by the lack of access to outside information. One big moment is centered on this conservative candidate called Adeyemi, who is screwed over by Tremblay, as Tremblay invited a former lover of his to Rome, so that she would make a scene and make his romantic indiscretions obvious to everyone. There's a moment where the main character, Lawrence, in investigating, discovers a secret letter hidden in the bedpost of the late Pope. This does feel kind of dumb to me, like the fact this happened to be discovered by the one guy in charge of organizing things, and that is how the Pope chose to make the corruption of Tremblay obvious, when he could have just told someone about it. Like, most of this mystery feels kind of interesting, but a character stumbling upon a hidden letter that provides all the proof feels kind of cliche. Anyway, while all of this is going on, there's a terrorist bombing campaign presumably being carried out by radical Islamists. One of the bombs is able to cause substantial damage to the building they're in, which I think would be better guarded. Anyway, this then leads to the final conservative candidate, Tedesco, making a big deal about how this means we need to kick out all the Muslims, because he's a conservative. And then this Mexican cardinal called Benitez, who oversees Afghanistan, says, actually, we should love each other. Now, at this point, I was anticipating that suddenly out of nowhere, Benitez would win, even though that doesn't really make much sense to me, that this unknown guy would win everyone over based on one speech. But it's especially weird because Benitez was a bit suspect as a cardinal in the first place. He showed up at the last minute, and people weren't sure if he was actually supposed to be there because he wasn't on the list. So after he's elected Pope, suddenly this assistant is like, actually, I looked into Benitez a bit more, and something's suspicious. And honestly, this moment was very exciting because so much has been happening and there's been so much intrigue and suspicion that the idea that this meek Mexican from Afghanistan has just pulled the wool over everyone's eyes is a really shocking development. And they find out he was supposed to get a hysterectomy, and you're like, oh, so this person's actually a female, which on the one hand is incredible because that would be so scandalous if a female was unknowingly elected Pope due to presenting as male. On the other hand, I was expecting something a bit darker in a way. Anyway, turns out Benitez seemingly isn't a female at all, but just a male with a difference of sexual development. So that's not as interesting. Like, Catholicism has clear rules against women being the Pope, but I don't know if there are any specific rules on how that's complicated by natural variability that can be seen within the two sexes. The issue with this plot is I feel like it's very reliant on mystery and then subsequent revelations. But that does make me doubt the capacity of this film to withstand a rewatch. Now that I know all the twists and turns, am I going to get much out of it without that surprise? Obviously this film has themes, but personally I always find themes around religion to be kind of pointless. Like, either you believe the religion or not. I'm a Baptist, so for me, watching a film about how the Catholic Church is super corrupt, has abandoned the Bible, and is mostly driven by personal ego to the detriment of any real unity is, well, I already knew that. I want to see the Congregationalist version of this film. Uh-oh, there's a crisis in the church! Now we'll have to go to the church on the other side of town instead. In all seriousness, to me this movie just felt kind of preachy. Like, we're clearly supposed to go into this with the understanding that the liberal reformers are all correct, but that sort of just rings hollow if you're not a liberal reformer, or aren't a Catholic at all and as such just don't care. Still, it's obviously a very competently shot movie, and there's some good acting. I just think its over-reliance on mystery and surface-level interpersonal drama kind of feels a bit cheap at times. As such, for me, it's a low 6 out of 10. My experience in watching Anora is a fun example of what it's like when you're watching a movie and you didn't even bother to look up the genre of the film, never mind the synopsis or a full trailer. Because obviously you can pick up quickly this is about the sex industry, and then that there's this super rich Russian guy who you could reasonably infer is some kind of gangster. So for the first 40 minutes I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this movie to descend into the dark violent world where organized crime intersects with the sex trade. But when Vanya's bodyguards show up and Anora starts aggressively resisting, I realized this probably isn't going to be a violent film, because no character would act this way to a bunch of scary Russian dudes unless they already knew the movie they were in is basically a farce. Because that's kind of what this movie becomes. Well, it's a movie of 3 parts really. The middle part is a farce where they're chasing around this intoxicated Russian called Vanya. The beginning is when he and Anora start dating and eventually get married in Vegas, and the conclusion is their marriage ending and the fallout from that. The issue of this movie, in my view, is that a lot of it's just Anora playing catch-up with the audience. You know, it's really obvious that Vanya would be a spoiled brat. And then he runs away instead of facing up to his parents' opposition to their marriage, and he ends up getting a lap dance from Anora's rival at the strip club. And even after all that, Anora's still trying to get him to continue with the marriage. At this point I was assuming she was just in it for the money, and there's no way she actually likes or cares about this dude. I was 50-50 on that before he abandoned her to go get high and cheat on her. But then in the third act of the film, it almost seems like it's treated as some sort of development when Vanya is revealed to be a massive jerk. Was anyone thinking anything else? On the inverse, there's this guy called Igor who is presented as a sympathetic character, but again, he's presented as such throughout the entire movie. So there's a bit where he's like, Vanya should apologize because he's obviously strung Anora along, and that feels like it's supposed to be showing he's the nice guy of the group, but he always was. Overall, this movie is really lacking in interesting developments. Like, there's a moment where Anora says she's going to get a lawyer and sue Vanya in an effort to get money from the divorce, but then she just immediately gives up on that idea. The beginning also felt kind of pointless, like the fact that Vanya's intoxicated for almost the entire film means we get no impression of him as a character, because drunk people don't really have a personality beyond just being obnoxious. And then for the rest of the film, Vanya is either absent or intoxicated, so we continue to know very little about him, and when he does make a decision, it's basically just submitting to his parents. So all we learn is he's a cowardly mama's boy, which I could have guessed about any Nepo baby. I feel like this film is longer than it needed to be, but I guess my real issue here is that I didn't really connect with any moment of the entire runtime. Anora's a kind of interesting character. She's very forthright early on, but at the end of the film she has an emotional breakdown. The problem for me is just, well, yeah, that's what you would do. The issue is it's kind of treated as the emotional climax of the film, but it's a reaction that would have been appropriate to have at almost any point. I assume this film has something to say about gender in relation to the sex trade, like the way this woman has been used and discarded. I just imagine that's an interpretation many have made. My issue is that this is obvious. Yes, the sex industry is evil. Getting intoxicated isn't a good way of living your life. This movie is about nothing more than a woman in the sex industry who hangs out with a guy who gets intoxicated, and it turns out that isn't a strong foundation for a lasting relationship. We've just got to wait around 2 hours while she figures that out. I guess I'll return back to the genre point that I started this with. This movie isn't a crime thriller as I thought it might be. Instead, it's listed on Google as a romantic comedy. Well, it's certainly not at all romantic, but it's also not funny. I described it as a farce, but it's not a farce in some really entertaining way. Indeed, nothing about this movie is massively entertaining. I struggled to watch it all the way through, and having finished it, I just can't help but think of it as a series of things that happened that I have no strong opinion on. So for me, it's going to be a high 4. I wasn't expecting to finish this movie having not really experienced anything, but that's basically what happened. So let's talk about the substance. I guess the first thing I should say is that this movie is very disturbing and disgusting, which I'm not sure is a good thing. It kind of overshadows everything else. If you were to ask me to distill my opinion of the film to a word, I'd say gross. Obviously you can argue a film being emotionally visceral suggests some level of artistic merit, but I'm not sure that's always true, and it's true of being gross least of all. Like, for a movie to really scare me or endear me or humour me requires some talent beyond just showing an image. The problem with grossness is you could show footage of surgery or someone taking a dump, and I'd say, that's gross. Now, that's not me saying that in the case of this movie, there's no talent to how the grossness is communicated. The sound effects and the shots and the specific way the movie builds all do communicate a conscious effort to build up how gross the movie is. A lot of the shots are vibrant and visually interesting, but I'm not sure I loved what it was in service of. I will say this is not one of those movies that works as a conventional narrative. In a conventional narrative, you're supposed to relate to the characters in the film. Here, I just couldn't do that, because the basic premise is that a formerly famous woman who's worried about aging starts taking this random medication that causes a younger clone of her to exist, but they have to take turns existing, and this causes a conflict between them, leading to disastrous results. The issue is, no real person would actually get experimental medication from this place that looks like a crack den. Especially since you don't even get to control the younger version of you. She just gets to live this great life, and you have some vague sense that she's you. So I'm not watching this film like, ooh, how's she going to get out of this one? Because I'd only have those thoughts about a movie where I was working on the assumption characters were going to behave like real people. Instead, despite this medication seeming very experimental and high stakes, the younger version of her quite quickly starts to abuse the system and ignore a lot of the rules in order to outstay her allotted time. Also, the older version of herself is so consumed with self-hatred that she just spends her whole time alone, refusing opportunities to socialize, and waits for the time to pass so she can be young again. And then things accelerate rapidly from there until this basically just becomes a story about a woman choosing to destroy her own life. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, it means I won't relate to the character, but there are some fantastic movies where characters don't behave like real people. What makes those movies fantastic is if they have something really thematic to say. This is quite obviously about aging, people's anxieties around aging, kind of about the beauty standards placed on women. I don't know if it can be credited with saying that much about this. The characters speak in very obvious ways, but this is something I can excuse for more absurdist films. There are some other moments where the movie is a bit obvious though. Early on she gets a bouquet of flowers that says, "You were amazing." And I noticed that it said "were" and thought it was kind of clever to have that specific wording, but then the next shot was a very zoomed in shot of the word "were." It's little moments like that which kind of make the film feel a little less intelligent. When you notice something, assuming it will be a subtle detail, but then the film draws your attention to it. But the real issue is, even while this film is very obvious with its point and isn't even constrained by having to have characters talk and act like real people, it still doesn't make any especially profound point about its subject matter. At the end, I was waiting for some kind of clever twist, but there wasn't really anything, except I did like the ending with it going full circle as her disintegrating body crawls towards and ultimately perishes on top of her Hollywood star that we saw at the start of the film. So if this film isn't that thematically substantive, and it doesn't allow me to relate to the characters, then the only thing I could really appreciate would be the visuals. And the visuals are striking, but again, it just comes back to the fact this movie is gross. And I'm not sure how to rate that. I've actually never had to rank a movie before where my prevailing feelings were just ugh. I didn't enjoy watching the film, but I can appreciate that it's probably the boldest and most intense body horror film I've seen. The premise is quite original, and certainly this movie could have been a lot worse in terms of how they incorporated these horror elements, but still, how high can I rank it when I just said I didn't enjoy watching it? It's a low 4 from me. Next, I watched Emilia Perez. I try not to be a sheep, but sometimes I wish there wasn't any sort of discourse about films, because then I do actively have to try to be like, okay, let me just put all of that out of my mind and review this film. But in some sense, the controversy is a lot more entertaining than the film itself, because the film isn't even that controversial. Obviously, the trans issue is controversial, but this film doesn't really have a discernible message in that regard. So I'm just going to put all the politics aside and just review this as a film. Honestly, I found it very boring, and for me, there are two main issues. The biggest issue is I have no idea why the main character, Rita, wants to help Benitez, who later becomes Emilia Perez. The inciting incident is already very stupid. She gets a call from some random sinister sounding dude who gives a strong impression he's spying on her. He's like, "Hey, if you want to make some money, then meet us by the newsstand." So as soon as she actually decides to go to the newsstand, I was immediately checked out of this film, because there is not a single woman in the entire universe who would go to that newsstand. And then, when she goes there, some men restrain her and put a bag on her head. In this moment, I had an intrusive thought of just imagining that they then kill her and dump her body somewhere, and the movie just moves on to something else, and everyone would just be confused about the random woman at the beginning who behaves really stupidly and then dies in the first 5 minutes. But instead, what she actually finds out is there's a cartel leader who wants to transition to being a woman. Now, what I don't really understand is, why does Rita actually try to help Benitez at all? I mean, the obvious answer would just be money and intimidation, but the film doesn't really feel like that. The vibe early on is that for some reason getting this dude a sex change operation is Rita's top priority, like it's a mission for her or something. But even if you wanted to say initially she isn't personally invested in it, even though it really does seem like she is, later on she definitely does seem to have a personal connection to Emilia, but they never established that. So for me, that's the central issue at the heart of this plot. It's supposed to be about these two characters, but there's no discernible connection between them that's ever built up. It's borderline impressive, that's my biggest issue, considering this is a musical that doesn't have a single good song in it. In fact, it has some songs that I'd say are as close as music can get to objectively bad. The famous example is the "From Penis to Vagina" song. I mean, what else can be said about that hasn't been said already? Not only is it just phonically awful, but the lyrics are like the lyrics of a baby. Another song I dislike that I haven't seen mentioned by anyone else is the song that Perez's ex-wife Jessie sings after being back in Mexico. I think my big issue is that she doesn't really sound convincing in how she's performing it. And the final thing I'll say is that there's this one song where they're singing about Emilia and Epifania, and it sounds a lot like the song "A Boy Like That" from West Side Story. I consistently use West Side Story as my benchmark for a good musical, because the reason we know it's a good musical is that you can listen to the soundtrack right now on Spotify and you will love every single song. How can you say it's not a good musical when every single song is a banger? But yeah, obviously I'm not going to credit this movie with reminding me of some other songs I like. Anyway, aside from that, the middle of the movie is pretty boring. Emilia pretends to be a female relative of Benitez in order to justify having Jessie and the children over to stay. The big tension is that Jessie ends up hooking up with another guy, so obviously I was thinking that this could make Emilia jealous, but at first this isn't an issue. The middle of the film is just about starting a charity to help victims of cartel violence in Mexico, and honestly it's all very boring. It only gets exciting when Jessie says that she plans to marry her new lover, and at that point Emilia gets violently jealous. Indeed, Jessie's lover is violently intimidated into leaving town, presumably on Emilia's orders. And then suddenly out of nowhere, Emilia is the one who gets kidnapped by Jesse and her lover so they can get the money that they were erstwhile dependent on Emilia for. So there's a bit of a shootout, and then at that point Emilia admits to having been Manitas, which causes Jesse to have a change of heart and completely turn against her lover and criminal accomplice. They have a fight in the car, causing them to lose control, and the car crashes, killing all three of them. I will say this ending feels kind of pointless and unmotivated, and has me struggling to imagine I could, in any possible universe, enjoy rewatching this film, knowing the central plot ends like this. And then Rita ends up taking care of the kid, which I think is paying off when they had a stray conversation about her wanting kids at some point. It's not something that's characterized beyond that. Which, of course, shouldn't be surprising because, like I say, my central issue is that the characterization and motivation of Rita makes no sense in general. The charity thing where they try to stop cartel violence, I don't know why I've written, sorry, this is just like completely off script. For some reason in the script, at two separate points now, first time I corrected it, I've described them as trying to stop cartel violence. That's not what they're doing in the movie. I don't know why I wrote that, because that's the thing. They're not trying to stop cartel violence. All they're trying to do is help people who are related to those who've been victims of cartel violence find out what's happened to them. And I'm just really annoyed at my prior self who wrote this script for me to read now for twice just writing out. And I knew this, like when I wrote the script, I knew this wasn't the case. I mean, I'd seen the movie more recently when I wrote the script than I had now as I'm talking about and recording this. And yeah, it's not about them trying to stop cartel violence, so clearly I'm just a moron. Anyway, it kind of makes sense with Rita's character because early on she communicates she doesn't feel good about having to represent criminals as a defense lawyer, so now she's doing something good. But that's not something she knew about when she first started working with Manitas, or indeed 4 years later when she then agreed to start working with Emilia. And she's not even the one who suggests it. You may have noticed I've said almost nothing about the whole trans thing in this review. That's because this movie, in my estimation, really isn't that much about being trans. Like, yeah, obviously it presents that and you can analyze it if you want, but I wouldn't say this movie is some sort of deep thematic thesis statement on being trans or anything like that. So when I review this film, I'm just focusing on my issues with the plot and presentation, and as such, I'm giving this a low 3 out of 10. That might sound harsh, but you know, it's a musical that has actively bad music. What rating should I give it? So I watched Wicked, Part 1. It's Part 1. Great. I'm so bored. I'm so tired. I have no goodwill left in me, for I am filled only with hate. This movie says it will teach us where evil comes from, and how someone becomes wicked. And I guess I discovered the answer. It's watching one too many of these god-forsaken films. A villain backstory where we find out actually they were a super nice, idealistic person, and it's the traditional good guys from the original story who are evil. Also, she was bullied when she was young because she was green, which is the same backstory the Grinch has in the Jim Carrey film. So again, 0 points for originality. Like, is this supposed to be subversive? The good guy from the original film is actually an evil person who is planning to turn humanity against animals through a campaign of political hatred intended to control the population by giving them a unifying scapegoat. Indeed, the main animal character is a literal goat. A goat, by the way, who can't pronounce the name Galinda except for as Glinda, which makes no sense. That's not how mispronouncing words works. Spanish people can't pronounce a sp sound without a vowel at the start, so they pronounce it Espanish. English people struggle to pronounce ng without a vowel at the start in the way it's done with Vietnamese names. But anybody can sound out the individual consonants of a sound with vowels in it. If you can say the name Glinda, you can say the name Galinda, because all you're doing is making the two sounds you're already making and just putting an ah sound in there. So yeah, screw this go. I'm glad he's being persecuted, pretending he can't pronounce people's names when it would be easy for him to do so. I didn't like any of the characters here. I mean, Ariana was kind of entertaining just because she's sort of prissy and silly. I always liked Jeff Goldblum, but the whole thing with Galinda and Greenie, I can't remember her name. Oh, it was Elphaba. Their relationship was really underdeveloped while somehow being the near sole focus of a 2-hour and 40-minute movie. I mean, them hating each other was well established and kind of entertaining in the way they contrasted, but then they just became friends because they did each other a favor, and they only did each other a favor because of a misunderstanding. Elfie thought that Galinda was doing something nice, but actually, Galinda was trying to be mean. And then, Galinda is only genuinely nice to her after that because she feels bad. But pretty much from that moment on, the film acts as if they're genuinely friends, but I never felt like they were. Like, even towards the end of the film where Elfie is getting praise from the wizard, I was kind of expecting Galinda to be resentful about it. Obviously, if someone was actually your friend, then you'd be happy that they're succeeding, but this film doesn't give us a reason to think these two actually are sincerely friends, certainly nothing like as much of a reason it gives us to think they'd hate each other. I don't know, I think it's a problem with a film when it's supposed to ultimately be about a rift being torn in a friendship, but it does a much better job showing us why these two hate each other than ever showing us why they'd like each other. Also, I know Harry Potter didn't invent teaching magic in schools, but when the school starts teaching animals are bad, I did write the exact words in my notes, "What is this Professor Umbridge arse plot point?" Because it felt very reminiscent of the bad guys taking over Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix. When they rescued that lion cub, I caught myself thinking, oh, I wonder if he grows up to be Aslan. And then I remembered this isn't about the evil queen from Narnia, although I'm sure some studio hack is going to come up with a brilliant idea of making an evil queen prequel movie where it turns out actually she was a wonderful misunderstood person and it was actually Aslan who was evil. But this is about the Wizard of Oz. We know this because of all the obnoxious prequel moments like, hey everyone, I'm thinking of building a road that leads to Emerald City, but I'm not sure what colour it should be. By the way, there are a few other characters here, but none of them really have anything interesting to do. There's Elfie's disabled sister who barely gets any dialogue. There's a handsome Prince Charming guy who again barely does anything. There's Linguini from Ratatouille who's dating Elfie's sister but secretly has a crush on Galinda. Anyway, time for a compliment break. I like the random made-up words they say sometimes, like braverism, like real words that have just been slightly modified to sound unnecessarily long. I also like when Elfie corrected Galinda for saying could care less when it should logically be couldn't care less. But at the same time, linguistic prescriptivism does suggest a kind of judgmental attitude and an intolerance of difference, so maybe that should have been the backstory for why she's evil. Also, since this is a musical, I'll address whether I enjoyed the music. I enjoyed the song they sing about loathing each other, which I guess is consistent with my general appraisal that this film does a much better job showing why they hate each other than it ever does showing their friendship. I also like a portion of the Emerald City song because it has a nice melody, and I like the fact that I recognize the Gravity song at the end as the most famous song from the musical. Also, it reminded me of the song Gravity by Pixie Lott, which I like and listen to as a palate cleanser after finishing this. Suffice it to say, none of these songs passed my core litmus test for a good musical, which is being a song I'd actually want to search up for the sake of listening to and enjoying in isolation. I don't think I've ever ducked out of a movie as immediately as I did for this one. As soon as the credits started, I was gone. I was poised in anticipation of it being over. There may have been an end credit sequence, but I wouldn't know. Hi to, boring, uninspired, derivative, waste of my time. Next, I watched the movie The Girl with the Needle. This movie is about a poor struggling woman who has an extramarital pregnancy after being abandoned by her husband. She ends up giving her baby to a woman who supposedly sells the babies on to childless couples. In reality, it turns out the woman is murdering them. I will admit, the impact of this revelation is slightly lessened on me because I couldn't help but notice that the killer, Dagmar, charges the women for taking the baby off their hands. And I was thinking, why would any woman agree to that? Presumably, they're giving this baby up because they're financially desperate in the first place. And also, if they think the baby is going to a wealthier couple who can give them a better life, it makes way more sense that they would pay for the baby. So if anything, Dagmar should be paying women for their babies. So that whole thing made no sense to me, and I was assuming it was just added so that the main character, Caroline, has some debt to Dagmar, and that's why she's roped into working for her as a wet nurse. So when you find out she's not selling the babies on to wealthy couples, but just murdering them, obviously it's sad, but it also feels kind of expected in that it makes sense. That explains why she needs to charge the mothers. I'm not sure why Dagmar brings Caroline in to work for her if she doesn't actually care about taking care of the babies. Her role is as a wet nurse, but why would you need to give milk to babies you're just going to kill at some point anyway? Also, there's a baby who Caroline takes care of for a while, and then Dagmar takes her away and kills the baby, but why didn't she do that right away? I'm just confused by the motivations. At one point, I almost thought this was going down some weird fetish territory because Dagmar has a line about how she used to milk cows on a farm when she was growing up, and I was like, oh, is she keeping Caroline around because she's into the idea of milking her? But no, I'm pretty sure the film doesn't go down that route. It certainly is a very weird, unpleasant film though. I mean, these babies are so cute, so I don't want to see them murdered. The most upsetting scene is when Dagmar basically forces Caroline to crush a baby to death herself. Don't like that. Also, I'm not sure where else to mention this, but the film is in black and white and a non-standard aspect ratio. Whenever a film is like that and there's not a very obvious reason for it, I do kind of think, have they just done that to give the film some bonus artsy points? Not sure. I mean, aside from that the film is set in the past, there's no reason for this. Another thing that bothers me is that there's no real reason for why everything falls apart at the end. The police just show up with no explanation and suddenly decide to arrest her. It just felt kind of arbitrary. Also, the whole plot surrounding Caroline's pregnancy kind of gets abandoned. As I said, her husband is missing and she has a whole relationship with a factory owner, and when she gets pregnant, he agrees to marry her. But then his mother disapproves of the marriage for no clear reason, so then he just caves to his mother immediately like this is Anora or something. We never see either of these characters again, so I'm not entirely sure what the point of them being included is. In the midst of this, her husband does show up having snuck off to fight in World War I, but he's been disfigured by the war. She rejects him nominally because he abandoned her, but I also imagine him being disfigured didn't help. She then sees him later on as a circus performer, and then at the end she meets him again, still as a circus performer, but there's not really any resolution to this plot point. Also, I may be crazy, but he seems less deformed at the end. In his middle appearance, the right side of his face is drooping, such that his eye socket is halfway down his cheek, and he clearly has a glass eye. But by the end of the movie, his eye socket appears to be back in the normal place and not look like a glass eye. In fact, I'm going to include some screenshots to prove the point. Look away if you don't want to see a kind of scary looking face. But if you are looking, then I assume you can see as clearly as I can that these just aren't the same faces. Anyway, special effects inconsistencies aside, my main issue is I'm not sure what this guy's plot really communicates. I think the obvious relevance would be the general idea of people being viewed as disposable. Injured and disabled people are often viewed as burdens on society, just as babies are viewed as burdens. And this is brought together in one moment where a baby is born with a slight physical deformity too. If the film has a singular message, it's most obviously expressed at the end. People treat it as a great evil that Dagmar killed all these babies. But then we get a panning shot of a whole load of newborn babies side by side in cribs crying in what we can infer is an orphanage. The message isn't exactly subtle. We condemn the murder of these babies as a great evil, but we clearly don't actually care about them that much considering there's an institution filled with children who are basically abandoned. Dagmar also talks about helping the women by killing their babies, and I guess there's a relevance of abortion here. I mean, the reason why the movie is called The Girl with the Needle is because at one point she tries to stab herself to abort the baby since she works as a seamstress at the start of the film. So again, I think this is probably hinting at the hypocrisy of pro-lifers who don't support social programs that actually help children in need once they're actually born. You know, Dagmar wanted to kill these babies just like Caroline did with her knitting needle, and while that sounds awful, it's also awful that many of these babies are basically abandoned. So I think that's a pretty obvious theme to pick up from the movie. I wouldn't say the film explores it in a deep, subtle, or intricate way, but it's there. Aside from that though, you mostly just have the plot, and I think I've made my issues with the plot very clear. There's also the broad emotional discomfort of the subject matter, but that's not something I especially appreciate. And overall, I just didn't get enough out of this film to justify wanting to watch it again. I'm still waiting for one of these films, all thus far nominated for Best Picture, to actually get a really positive reaction from me. So far, I've been disappointed. I'll give this film a low 6, which is mostly for all the technical stuff it gets right, but I couldn't possibly give it a higher rating considering all the issues I've expressed. Next, I watched A Real Pain, which is a story about two Jewish cousins who travel to Poland to discover aspects of their own Jewish heritage. One thing this film deals with is the entire idea of how do we talk about and engage with the tragedy of history. There's one moment where one of the cousins, Benji, objects to the way that the tour guide just lists off facts in every place they go because he thinks that makes engaging with the real history less emotional and human. And then there's another moment where he acts super sanctimonious about them being in first class on the train because the last time his ancestors were on a train in Poland, they were being taken to concentration camps. Honestly, I've always found first class on trains to be kind of pointless. Firstly, very few train rides last as long as your typical flight, and also, you usually have plenty of room on trains anyway because it's on the ground, so they don't have to conserve weight and therefore space as much. Obviously, I appreciate that's not the point, but I'm just making observations from my experience. Like that they make a big deal out of avoiding the ticket inspector for one ride because they don't have tickets, but in my experience riding trains in Europe, there's almost never anyone who actually checks that. The real thematic point that their tour guide touches on is this fundamental question of whether it's appropriate to make a vacation out of exploring the legacy of the Holocaust. A vacation is always going to be in some sense kind of fun, but how can you reconcile yourself to the idea that you can enjoy even a single moment of a trip that should be dedicated to reflecting on a tragedy? So that is interesting, but well, We already know it's interesting because Zone of Interest already covered this exact same topic last year. I won't repeat the point because you can just go back and watch my review of that film, but I'll just say I really don't think this film adds anything substantial to that question of how we engage with tragedy. But this film isn't just about the themes, it's also very centered on characters. Not really about the plot, since the plot is literally just some people on holiday. The characters are kind of interesting. Most of the rest of the people on the tour aren't especially worth commenting on, but there is a clear sense of them being well-rounded. The most interesting peripheral character is this Rwandan guy who survived the genocide and then felt a kinship with Jews and converted to Judaism based on that. I imagine victims of the ongoing genocide might not feel quite the same kinship with Jews, but whatever. The real main character is the aforementioned Benji, played by Kieran Culkin. I will admit that it doesn't speak to his talent as an actor when he's playing literally the exact same character he plays in Succession, an irreverent, obnoxious guy who's clearly compensating for some underlying emotional vulnerability. If I wanted to be taken seriously as an actor, I'd probably try to seek out a radically different role to avoid being typecasted. Experiencing this character in the film is a bit of a mixed bag. Firstly, I was kind of uncomfortable the whole time because Benji's lack of filter means at any moment he could say something awkward. And indeed, a lot of the time he is just being a bit of a knob. Like when he willfully misses the stop on the train and the entire tour group then has to wait for him to catch the train from the next stop going back on himself. There were some moments where I felt like this was going to be a cheesy manic pixie dream boy plot, a bit like a Robin Williams movie where his wacky unorthodox antics endear everyone to him. And there are some cheesy moments like where he's doing crazy wacky things that totally go against social convention, but everyone really appreciates him for it and has a good time. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but it's just a bit cliche. With this said, honestly, my favourite moment of the movie, hands down, is when he leaves to go to the bathroom and his cousin David apologises for how obnoxious he's being, and in that moment, basically everyone acknowledges that he's a twat. It's an area where this film really breaks from convention with other movies. Usually when you have a character like this, the audience is aware they'd be annoying, but all the characters act like they're the best ever, and indeed around Benji to his face, they're all largely being friendly and accommodating and receptive to his wacky behaviour, so to see them all suddenly just be like, oof, that guy, no thanks, the second he leaves is powerful. Maybe I relate to it because I have a kind of big personality, and sometimes I dominate the conversation and act a bit weird in social groups, and I wonder whether everyone around me is just humouring me and deep down everyone's thinking, alright, give it a rest, mate. I guess to me it feels kind of meta in that it gets at the difference between movies and real life. If someone made a movie about my life, you'd be able to see what people really think of me, but I can't see that. If Benji was a real character, he wouldn't know that everyone says this when he's out of earshot. After this scene, it became a lot easier for me to appreciate Benji as a nuanced character because the film had made the good and the bad aspects very clear. And it's also made crystal clear that a lot of his big personality is compensating for a deep sense of sadness and vulnerability. The film is also more specifically about Benji's relationship with his brother David. David is very unsubtly shown to be uptight, which obviously massively contrasts with Benji. They do have some bonding moments, but the real tension is that David clearly feels some kind of, I guess to use a thematically relevant term, you might say survivor's guilt about Benji. He feels bad that his life is relatively put together, while Benji has no plan for his life and seems to be inexorably depressed and unable to confront any problems in his life seriously. The film doesn't have any ultimate resolution to this, which I kind of liked, although I wouldn't say this lack of resolution is super subversive, because based on the issues they establish, I'm not sure what resolution they could possibly have even contrived. Still, it is quite emotionally convicting having followed this character and gained a full appreciation of his many problems to be left at the end of the film with no reason to think he's going to turn his life around for the better. So there are things to appreciate here, but overall, a lot of this film is pretty average, obvious, and unoriginal. I'm going to give this film a low 6, but honestly, part of that is because at least this film is appropriately short. It's a quite simple story that doesn't overstay its welcome. If it were 2 hours, I'd probably give it a high 5. After this, I watched the movie A Different Man, and I don't really get it. I should be honest and say that my experience of the film initially was a little bit confusing because the movie is about a deformed man called Edward who undergoes a surgery to make himself look basically normal. By the way, I'm sure that people will object to the word deformed, but I don't know what the politically correct term is, so blame society for not communicating that to me. Now, I knew that this movie starred an actor called Adam Pearson, and my assumption was that Pearson was playing Edward before the treatment, and then the other actor was playing him after the treatment. So, as such, in thinking these were two different actors, I was trying to suss out the quality of the acting and thinking, I'm not sure if I like this acting because he's behaving very differently now that he looks normal, and it makes for a disconnect in the character. But, turns out, I'm an idiot because actually it's the same guy playing Edward the whole time, and instead Pearson plays a different character called Oswald. So whatever my opinions on the acting, at least the makeup is clearly fantastic. I will say, for me, this film is generally not so absurd that the premise of there being medical treatment that completely cures him doesn't leave me asking questions. I was assuming that maybe a little like The Substance, this movie was going to be about the psychological impact of the treatment itself and also the potential side effects. Instead, the treatment is entirely uncomplicated, and beyond experiencing some physical distress as his entire face melts to be replaced by a different one, which, you know, must be tough, it's all pretty uncomplicated. So I do kind of think when deformed people continue to exist in this movie, shouldn't Edward mention to them that there's a way to completely fix this issue? Of course, the question there though is whether looking this way is actually a problem. It's pretty clear the film is trying to challenge that. There's an unrelated line about bad acid trips where Oswald says that it's all about how you frame it, and I guess that's supposed to be the wider point of the movie. Sometimes though, I think this message goes a bit far to the point of being unrealistic. When we see Edward's life at the start of the film, everyone's staring at him, people are laughing at him, people are shown to be scared as soon as they see him. I actually really like the way at the start we see him acting in a role, and I assumed it was going to be some kind of serious role, and then later we find out that actually it's just a tiny line in an employee training video about how to deal with deformed co-workers. I found that moment really sad, just to see that this guy wants to be an actor, but the only role he can get is delivering one line in a corporate training video. But then Oswald comes along and he is insanely popular and everyone loves him and thinks he's really talented, but I can't help but think, surely he'd at least have some of the same issues considering he looks really similar to how Edward did at the start of the film. I'm not sure what Oswald's relatively charmed life as a deformed man is supposed to be communicating, because what we actually see is Oswald being so popular and well-liked that he basically ends up usurping Edward professionally and socially until Edward ends up becoming insane. But why? I mean, Edward is an incredibly attractive guy with a good job, so I just don't understand what thematically or emotionally I'm supposed to be getting from him just throwing that all away. The most intense moment is when Edward stabs a guy and ends up going to prison, but that happens after the guy in question makes a disparaging comment about Oswald behind his back. So Edward hates it when Oswald is popular and everyone loves him, and he also hates it when people make mean comments about him. He hates it when he's deformed, and he hates it when he's handsome. You just can't please this guy. My basic interpretation is that maybe Edward is annoyed about Oswald because deep down he doesn't buy that people's enthusiasm for him is actually sincere, so when he gets confirmation that yeah, actually people do make fun of this guy behind his back, that finally makes him snap. I should also acknowledge the meta aspect of this film. Before the treatment, Edward meets a playwright, and then after that he adopts a whole new identity such that she doesn't recognize him or know who he is anymore. But she writes a play based on her experience with Edward, which he decides to audition for under the fake name of Guy. As such, there are some moments where they discuss the nature of Edward's story itself and the appropriate ways for them to tell it. This sounds interesting, but honestly I can't point to a single insight the film appeared to be communicating with this theatrical performance aspect, and that's really my big issue with the film. Neither thematically nor emotionally is there really that much I can pick out from this. I actually do think the acting was a little bit weak. I didn't really buy any of these performances as much as I'd like to. Still, the premise is kind of interesting, but goodness me do I struggle to imagine wanting to watch this film again. I think I've got to give this film a high 5. It doesn't have any serious problems with it, but I just struggle to get anything out of it, which is never a good sign. Next, I watched Septembre 5th. It's about the hostage situation at the Munich Olympics, but more specifically, it's about the news crew at ABC and the logistics of how they covered the story. So I actually really do like this idea for a movie. Firstly, on a basic level, it's interesting to see all the technicalities of how exactly you make a news story. And that's complicated by the fact that this is the sports team rather than the team that would typically deal with more serious news. It's obviously very meta. This is a piece of media telling a story about the way that media tells a story. And of course, thematically, it's very interesting and vaguely similar to A Real Pain and Zone of Interest, in that there's a similar tension between a very serious situation and a group of people whose experience of that situation is in some way dissonant with it. In some sense, this dissonance is actually the most interesting of those three examples, in that obviously the news crew is concerned about what's happening, but they're simultaneously really excited. A lot of the film is about them trying to secure the right shot, track down the right witnesses, and secure the time slot to make sure they're the ones covering the story. Towards the end of the film, someone mentions that they'll be getting a big bonus based on how many people watched the coverage, and the main character ends up receiving praise from his work, even though after the sobering reality of finding out people have died, he's clearly not feeling very much like celebrating. There are also some really interesting decisions they have to make, like whether they're actually going to be showing live footage when there's a risk someone might be killed in that footage, and when there are spurious reports about the end result of the whole situation, they decide to prematurely run a false narrative before they've got all the facts in. And then even after that, there's a sense that for the people working on the news, life needs to go on. They don't have time to grieve because they need to already start thinking about how they're going to cover the aftermath. I think what I really like is that there are some moments where you almost feel like these guys are involved in the rescue effort because you know what's going down and they're treating what they're doing as really important, but in reality they're just reporting on the situation, not doing anything to help it. And the disconnect there is what I find interesting, that it feels like this should be a movie about the people trying to actually change the outcome of what's going on rather than just reporting on it. There's this reporter who they basically have to sneak into an area so he'll be able to report on what's happening, and again, that covert operation feels like it should be about something a bit more important than just breaking a story. Indeed, a huge moment is when it's revealed they might be giving away the plan of the German police by broadcasting footage of what they're doing, which I thought was just a joke from The Simpsons.
What's the situation, Chief?
Well, we have an officer sneaking around the house, Kent, so unless they have a television in there or can hear my loud talking...
Ow, ow, ow.
Well, I guess that answers that, doesn't it?
Another interesting thing thematically relates to the whole experience of Jews in Germany only 30 years out from the start of the Holocaust. Someone mentions that Germany wants to rehabilitate their image, and another person makes a snide comment about how it seems like every German person's parents had absolutely no idea what's going on. It is crazy that if you're a working adult in 1972 from Germany, then there's a strong chance that your parents were one of the people who voted for the Nazis. Must be kind of awkward. Speaking of awkward, I'll now address the elephant in the room. While I think the basic idea of focusing on a news team covering a serious situation where lives are on the line is a really interesting idea, I must say that the specific choice of what to focus on seems misguided. I guess the main reason they did this is just that this was the first situation like this to be broadcast live in this way, or at least that's what the text at the end of the film claims. This isn't as bad of a movie like Golda, where the star of the film is literally an avowed Zionist. On the contrary, the director of this film claims it's not a statement on the ongoing ethnic cleansing in Gaza whatsoever. But still, doesn't take a genius to consider that people might be watching this film with a lot of baggage in their mind related to current events. So frankly, I'd massively prefer this film if it was exactly the same in terms of its theme and focus, but the context for the whole thing was some random made-up situation like an arbitrary apolitical mass shooting. Releasing the film with this as the main focus honestly just seems insanely tone-deaf and ignorant, and I'm not sure how much I can look past that. You know, it's only been a year since there were false reports of Palestinians beheading babies, and those lies were being used to justify the worst atrocities of the 21st century. And we also know that the armed forces of the Zionist occupation killed a lot of their own people and haven't taken responsibility for that. So to release a film like this now? It really does bother me. If you really wanted to know, I'd probably give the film a high 6 without that concern, but if I'm factoring in how inappropriate the subject matter is for this specific time, I'm going to give this a middling 5. Next, I watched The Seed of the Sacred Fig, which isn't that a weirdly similar title to the other movie, The Killing of the Sacred Deer? First we had a Scandinavian film called The Girl of the Needle, as if there wasn't already The Girl of the Dragon Tattoo, and now this. Anyway, my basic opinion on this movie can be summarized as, this looks interesting, or at least like it could get interesting. Yep, definitely going to get interesting. Any minute now. Okay, it's still not that interesting, but something could happen. Wow, I can't believe this movie is 2 3/4 hours long. It really doesn't seem like enough is happening to justify that. Oh, it's over. This is one of those movies where it keeps introducing and then abandoning plot threads. So it starts off with the revelation that this dad, called Iman, has been promoted to some high position in the Iranian justice system, and the first thing we're really told is that he needs a gun for protection, and it's sort of implied that there are organized criminals who target prosecutors based on who they convict. So, you know, it's kind of like the same way that executioners typically have their identity hidden so that they don't face reprisals from people seeking vengeance when they're the ones who do the killing. So at first I was thinking, alright, this could be a pretty interesting crime film centered around that. But no, it's not about that. It also at one point feels like it could be more about the conflict between family life and work life. Like Iman, as part of his job, is forced to work really long hours, and most nights he's coming home after the kids have gone to bed. So that could be nice, just a drama about a rift in the family caused by the demands of dad's new job. Although it's clear the new job is overall a good thing because it means their daughters no longer have to share a room. It's actually quite funny, the mother says when she finds out about the new job, "We can move into a bigger house because the girls are getting too old to be sharing a room." So I was thinking they'd be maybe around the age of 10. They look like they're closer to 20. Anyway, so then some anti-hijab revolutions start kicking off, and there's a load of drama around that. Obviously, the parents don't want their daughters getting involved with it because they could get arrested or seriously injured. The older daughter's friend gets seriously injured, and they try to sneak her into the house without their mother finding out about it, which, I mean, they live in an apartment, so obviously the mother's going to find out there's a girl there who's been shot in the face. But then that girl gets arrested because they're not able to give her proper medical treatment, so they need to take her to the doctors, and we never find out what happened to her. Still, this feels like it could be exciting, right? I mean, it's about a political revolution, except on the contrary, it's actually not very exciting at all, because both the parents basically just tell them not to get involved so they don't get injured and arrested, and the only real opposition the girls make is saying that the system isn't good and they just complain about it. But in terms of what actually happens, it's mostly just them chilling in their house, and I find myself thinking it seems like nothing's really going to change. If these girls weren't out insisting on protesting yesterday, there's no sense they're suddenly going to change tomorrow. Also, the film doesn't really communicate why the Iranian regime is oppressive. Indeed, the whole thing kind of comes across as pretty petulant. We hear these girls talking about how they want to paint their nails, dye their hair blue, and wear more form-fitting clothes. And sure, I recognize that when the literal government is telling women they're not allowed to do that stuff, then obviously that's the state overstepping and being oppressive. But the issue is, those are also the concerns of a bratty teenager in relation to her parents. Plenty of contemporary parents, even in the West, would object to their daughters dyeing their hair, wearing makeup at an inappropriate age, or wearing overly revealing clothing. So personally, I think that framing this whole protest through the lens of a teenage daughter arguing with her parents was an absolutely terrible decision, especially since it's not as if the parents are super strict Muslims. They mostly are just being pragmatic and pointing out that dressing in an unnecessarily provocative way is a pretty reckless thing to do considering the current climate. I will just take a moment to address the length of this film. I have said before that I like slow-paced movies. This movie is very slow-paced. The issue is, there isn't enough that actually happens to justify the runtime, and considering the movie is slow-paced, it should focus on a much more singular plot or theme. We're only halfway through the runtime in terms of what I've described, and there's already been 3 totally separate plots. Now, around this point we enter the main plot of the film, and the moment where it feels like something exciting might happen. See, Iman wakes up and discovers that his gun has been stolen, and there's a moment where I thought that maybe one of the girls had stolen his gun to go out and commit some kind of violent act of resistance. Obviously that would be a great development because it would make the girls seem like active protagonists rather than just petulant brats, and it would show how serious this revolution is. We also find out that for having lost his gun, Iman would face a punishment of prison for over 3 years, which if he knew that was the case in advance, he probably should have just put his gun in a safe, but then the plot couldn't happen. Although I say plot, it's barely a plot because they quickly establish that actually the girls are still there and everyone's saying that they didn't take it. And I mean, of course they didn't take it, because why would anyone in this family want to do an action that sends their dad to prison for over 3 years? Nothing he's done so far in this film would indicate the girls have any reason to resent him. I mean, sure, they're mad at the system, but as we've established, the dad isn't some ardent enthusiast for it either. He just seems to be trying to protect them by forbidding them from participating in the protests. Also, at the start of the film, when someone suggests he do something corrupt for the system, he's really resistant to it, and the only reason he does it is again to protect his family. Also, even if he did support the system, there are lots of American patriots who support the regime in their country, even though that murders way more people than any other country in the world and also detains and tortures people without charging them with any crime, and I'd say that's bad, but that doesn't mean every patriotic American dad deserves to go to prison for over 3 years. 2 at most. Anyway, the point is, because we know there's no reason for anyone in his family to want to sabotage him this way, we don't really have anything to go off in terms of who stole the gun, which makes the film pointless. Anyway, turns out his daughter stole the gun for some reason, and then I really don't know how to explain this in a way that will sound believable to someone who hasn't seen the film, but basically, the women all decide to protect each other, so I guess they've all decided that their dad, who hasn't done anything bad, should go to prison, and then he kind of works out that they're hiding something, so he confines them in separate rooms until they tell him what's going on, which, what else is he supposed to do? Just be like, oh, okay, well if you don't want to tell me where my gun is, I guess I'll just go to prison. Would any human being do that? Anyway, I don't know how to say this in a way that will sound believable to someone who hasn't seen the film, but I need you to know I'm not lying to you. For some reason, the final 15 minutes of this film is basically a slasher, where the dad is like hunting for them, and the girl ends up killing her dad with the gun. Again, I don't know what he was going to do with them if he found them. We literally don't see him act even slightly abusive to anyone at any point. So it's like a slasher film where the villain is just a confused dad who's wondering why his whole family is conspiring to send him to prison. I've spoken about this film for longer than I was expecting to. I mean, it's not that surprising that I've spoken about it for so long, because this was nominated for a Best International Film Award, and I think it's a middling 2. I genuinely think this film is complete rubbish. So hopefully in me explaining that this film introduces a load of plots, abandons them, and then has the final action beat hinge on motivations that make absolutely no sense, you can understand why I really dislike it. Oh, and sorry, I just remembered there's this really funny scene where they're running around the house, and it's literally like a Scooby-Doo chase scene. After this I watched Flow, and in dramatic contrast to the last film, I'm going to struggle to come up with something to say about it, but I'll do my best. In fact, I think I'm going to do what I always do when I'm trying to make an active effort to talk about a film, break it down into plot, artistic value, emotional resonance, and themes. But just talking about the plot is already quite complicated, because this is a movie about animals with no dialogue. Now that might immediately make you think of Robot Dreams, nominated last year, but the huge difference is in that movie the animals didn't talk, but they acted like humans. Gromit from Wallace and Gromit would be another example of this. But in this film, not only do these animals not speak, but they don't appear to be capable of cognition beyond what actual animals in our real world are capable of. Like, if you've ever owned a cat or a dog, then you'll be able to recognize that these animals in this film behave just like cats and dogs actually behave. At most, there are a few moments where maybe the main cat character is processing things on a slightly more sophisticated level than an actual cat would, but there's not much in it. As such, in talking about the plot, I'm really just talking about the things that happen to the characters, and I feel like characters is a weird word to use because these are actually just animals. So basically, for some unexplained reason, much of this world appears to be flooding, and most of this movie is just the animals taking the logical steps to avoid dying. When there's a violent flow of water, they run away from it, they go to high ground or swim to things that can float, and if they fall back into the water, they swim to safety. There's also a lemur character who expresses a degree of possessiveness of certain objects collected, and the dogs to a lesser extent. The cat also has some desire to possess frivolous objects, which again is in keeping with actual animal psychology, but in terms of discernible events, there's not really that much. The world building is quite interesting. This appears to take place in a post-human world where the remnants of human civilization are present, but are now interacted with exclusively by animals, like what looks like giant statues. Also, there's a whale-like character that appears to not quite look like an actual whale would look. It has some extra fins and stuff. I was kind of thinking we'd maybe see some explanation for why this world is the way it is, and was disappointed that didn't happen. Ordinarily I'm fine with mysteries left unresolved, but since in this film not much happens, I'd have liked it if we got at least some information about the story of how the world got to this point. The film also appears to have a very low budget, and at least to me the animation looked pretty cheap at some times, especially when the cat was moving. There was that uncanny sense that the cat had no real weight and was just computer generated. Also, I feel like the body didn't quite move right. My general opinion on animation is I prefer for it to be interesting even if it's not objectively high quality, but this does seem to be the most noticeably bad animation I've seen in a Best Animated Picture nominee recently. There are still some beautiful moments that don't involve more tricky things to animate like organic movement, some very beautiful vistas, especially since this is a world that is largely flooded, so lots of beautiful shots of the water. Also, they do manage to make the cat look very cute, and insofar as the animation is bad because it's simple, the simple animation style at least complements the base cuteness of the cat. I always think of cats as pretty dumb animals, so it kind of seems fitting to me that a story told from a cat's perspective would be missing some of the more granular details of reality. I don't know how much I can credit the film with the cat being cute though. I feel like God gets the credit there for making them, or Charles Darwin for inventing evolution. The point is, cats were already cute, and I don't know if it's that hard to animate a cat with some big round eyes and tap into that pre-existing cuteness. And aside from cuteness, this film actually wasn't that emotionally convicting. There weren't any sad moments or super exciting moments. I'd say serenity was the main feeling I picked up from this film, since it was largely about a group of animals chilling on a boat. It's also nice the way that they have an interspecies friend group by the end. Everyone loves it when cats and dogs are buddies, or when puppies hang out with kittens. Finally, I was interested in whether this film had any themes. I couldn't identify anything obvious from watching it, and in looking it up it's just the obvious ones of friendship, community, the will to survive, but I'm not sure if the film really says anything about that in depicting it. So I'm honestly not quite sure why everyone likes this movie so much, because frankly I feel like I'm being generous giving it a middling 6, and part of that is because at least the movie is very short at not even feature length, and as such for a nice relaxing experience it's a worthwhile watch, but I didn't get that much out of the movie. It's not the type of film I can see sticking with me into the future. After this, I watched Gladiator II. Now, I know that I said I would review the original film if I'm reviewing a sequel in order to actually provide context for what I'm talking about. However, in this case, I thought that would be stupid because Gladiator won Best Picture, so when I finally get around to reviewing the Oscars from the year 2000, I think it would be stupid to say, hey guys, I'm not going to be reviewing the actual Best Picture winner because I reviewed it 25 years ago. Anyway, just give me a moment to get over the existential crisis that I occasionally have as I work on this project that I plan to take up the next 48 years of my life and as such won't end until I'm 77. It's fine. I'm fine. I will, however, briefly say that I very much dislike Gladiator. I think it's quite a crap film, mostly because it's so historically inaccurate. It's possibly the only film I really, truly hate, specifically for its historical inaccuracy, because it's not just wrong on a few minor details, it's not just that the director made some understandable adaptive decisions to tell a complete story at the expense of the literal truth. No, the original Gladiator is in spirit fundamentally a lie, because the film is set after the reign of Marcus Aurelius and he is very upset about the current state of Rome. The film is about the reign of Commodus and ends with the implication that Rome is going to become a prosperous republic. The issue is that in reality, the reign of Marcus Aurelius marked a high point for the Roman Empire that had been enduring for a century. This period was called the period of the 5 good emperors, because these 5 emperors were considered the very best. So it makes absolutely no sense and is just a flat out lie for the film to start off saying that the imperial system is in crisis and a republic needs to be restored. And then obviously the end of Commodus marked the beginning of a low point for the empire, not the start of some golden age. As such, the analogy I always make is that Gladiator is like if someone made a film about Henry VIII and it started off talking about how England has fallen away from Catholicism and then ended with the promise that England would return to Catholicism going forward. That would make no sense because we know that actually the reign of Henry VIII was precisely when England turned away from Catholicism, having erstwhile upheld it as the official religion for a long time. So that's not just, oh, you know, they got the costumes wrong or these dates don't really line up. Gladiator is literally presenting the exact opposite of the truth, and I hate that. I hate it so much. So the first question is whether this film is historically inaccurate, and the answer is, it's not as bad. Like, yeah, there are some unnecessary issues that show a lack of care, such as Numidia being conquered by Rome at the start, even though it would have been conquered centuries ago. Lots of other similar issues like that. But what I can say is that this film isn't brazenly lying about the condition of Rome. It presents Rome as struggling with instability and corruption, and it is set during a time when that was the case. Also, a lot of the gladiatorial stuff is definitely exaggerated, but this is the type of historical inaccuracy I'm not only willing to tolerate, but actively endorse. Now would be a good time to mention that I like the TV show Spartacus, even though that show is insanely historically inaccurate. Not only is it borderline fantastical in areas, but it also presents gladiatorial matches as happening in big stone amphitheatres, even though that only really started with the rise of the empire. However, it's still broadly accurate in terms of how it portrays Roman society and also the story it tells about Spartacus's life. So I really like that this film has gladiators fighting baboons and rhinos, or features sharks swimming in the flooded amphitheatre during the mock naval battles. That kind of stuff is awesome. So this film gets a passing mark for historical accuracy, right? It's broadly accurate and all the inaccuracies are for the sake of making a more entertaining movie. Cool. Except, well, this movie is called Gladiator II. It is a sequel to that previous inaccurate movie, and as such it inherits a lot of issues. At the start I was just thinking that you could enjoy this movie by ignoring the previous film, and as such was quietly annoyed at the title and the way this film starts off with flashbacks to the end of the previous film, because already this film in existing invalidates the ending of the previous film. That one ended with the suggestion there would be a new republic, but this one, in being historically accurate, is forced to completely undo the entire plot of the last film. We still have the same corrupt and megalomaniacal people at the top leading Rome astray. But eventually this film relates itself much more substantially to the first, and obviously that just annoyed me even more because I don't like the first film. Essentially, this gladiator we're focusing on is actually the son of Russell Crowe from the last film, and also there's a whole effort to restore the Republic and finally complete the vision from the first film. The film ends with the crazy emperor being killed and the main character saying he will rebuild Rome as it should be. I look forward to Gladiator 3, where we'll find out that this also didn't happen and just pick up a generation later with Roman history being totally unchanged despite this irritating lineage of gladiators. The actual coup attempt itself feels really underdeveloped. This isn't exactly Game of Thrones. Basically, when the main character Hanno shows up, it turns out there's already a plan to overthrow the Empire in place, and a whole army just waiting outside the city, ready to go. So there's no interesting moment where we see some elaborate scheme unfolding. There aren't even many interesting battle scenes aside from the very start of the film, and even the more elaborate scenes look very cheap. The CGI in this film isn't great. Anyway, I might just wrap up and say that I could talk about every plot development, but the ultimate takeaway is that this film isn't annoying in its inaccuracy, but it is pretty unspecial in terms of what actually happens, and it's massively weighed down by being tied to the previous film. Still, I'll elevate it a bit for the entertaining schlock of some of the Gladiator fights, so let's say a low 5. Anyway everyone, that's the end of this video. Please do all of the algorithm things like share, comment, subscribe, and also if you click this screen now, it will show you a video that YouTube thinks you'll like, and if you click on it, it will tell YouTube more generally that you like my channel. Part 2 should be coming out next week. Bye.